So yes, the samples out of all, they are the extraordinary evidence for our extraordinary claims. Like, we used to rely on witness testimony. This is very valid. This is the way to go. But if we want to make a strong case, and if we want to better understand how exactly these things work, we need to get our hands on their materials, on their items. So that's what I do. I like to focus on that chapter of ufology because I believe it's the strongest one and the most helpful one for the understanding of this phenomenon. So I made this short presentation because I keep it short and to the point, in order to show our audience what our research has been on this topic in the last years, and what the next steps might be, and how maybe, just maybe, we might be beginning to see a few patterns that can help us understand how they work. So this, of course, requires us to delve into the science a little bit, and using microscope images from the laboratories. There will not be too many of them, but and I'll be sure to answer any questions anyone may have after the presentation. So our evidence comes, of course, in the form of the small pieces that were entrusted to us, and I call them little legends because even though they are small, each and every one of them is very valuable and full of potential. And the implications of some of the findings of some of them are absolutely immense. Now, of course, we cannot proceed without naming the absolutely number one, Dr. Roger Lear, who was the first to bring this subject to the attention of the wider public. His groundbreaking research involved rigorous scientific testing of these objects that he himself would surgically remove from the bodies of his patients or people. Now, even though the purpose of those so-called alien implants remained and still remains unknown, he was the first to find some clues that they may have something to do with the human nervous system, as they wrap themselves around nerve fibers and release certain substances that cause even more such fibers to form around them. So they're doing something with our nerves. After his death, his research seems to have faded into the background of ufology, despite it being the most glaring example of direct intervention in human affairs by a foreign intelligence. But the implants did not fade like the research did. They are still occurring. They are still being found, and some of them have found their way into our laboratories. They come in all shapes and sizes, and they're not made of ordinary materials. This is one of them, for example. Many of them are transparent. This one is actually transparent. It's not gray, it's not metallic. It looks like glass, and it takes the color of its surroundings. If you place it near something, near something that is blue, it will become blue, for example. Now, you can notice that it has some colorful things inside of it, and it's not sharp, so it's not glass. It doesn't feel like glass at all, actually. It's hard and heavy for its size. It's tiny, but it's still heavy. You can tell it's heavy for its size. It feels more like a transparent ceramic of sorts. And when you tweak the lighting and the angle just right, you can see that among the other objects, it too has those small hair-like things protruding from its body. And they are not hairs because, for one, it has never been touched by human hands, never. And under the microscope, and this is a very precise microscope, it's a scanning electron microscope used to give us details down to the micro nano scale. And you can see them better. I pointed them out with the arrows there because it's only in gray. So these fibers appear in several other objects, may not be playing a role in its function. And as you will see in another object that I will show in a few seconds, they have smaller fibers inside the larger ones. So there is some kind of a functioning role there. They may be used for attachment for all we know. Like this one, this other one, this is tiny. Again, those things are very small, but not all of them. But this one felt more like glass because when the witness tried to cut it with scissors, they couldn't. It would not be cut, and the scissor would slide, across the object, and you would hear the sound of metal sliding across glass. So it was hard. It was like when you tap your finger on a glass screen, for example. Definitely something weird, and it would latch on. Those teeth, those claws that it has underneath it, they were actually latched, onto the skin. So, of course, implants being implants, if they are not taken very proper care of, they will soon start breaking down. They will self-destruct. And there are a few ways to go about preserving them, which are very involved, and they're actually different for different kinds of objects. Some of them don't even seem to need a preservation, but others do. And unfortunately, for this case, by the time it arrived and we took it to the laboratory, it was reduced to basically dust. But still, we put that under the microscope, and sure enough, one of the most interesting pictures is this one. Again, you see the fibers protruding from underneath it, and you can also see the surrounding mechanism, of the fiber where it attaches. In another fiber that we zoomed into, you could see even more of these little fibers that I mentioned coming out of it. And when we zoomed in, they disappeared, and that was probably because of the charging, because this instrument uses electrons. It showers your sample with electrons to obtain the image. So if it showers, tiny fibers with electrons, they will repel each other, and they may, be caused to move back a little bit. But since we're talking about fibers and thin, straight samples, why don't we talk about this? This is probably the best implant that we have tested up to date. This one remains stable, but if stable here is relevant because it changed, it broke down, and then it reassembled. I had to see it in order to believe it. I never saw it changing or anything, but I saw it actually moving. Like here, for example. Now, this object is very tough. It is just a single millimeter in diameter. And even though I could not easily bend it, I had to keep trying for 10, 15 minutes in order to bend it ever so slightly in order to fit it into an XRF machine. But I will show you the results in a minute. And despite the fact it has been caught having changed, pose or moved, because you can see the loop. The central loop is changing in diameter, which causes the whole object to appear longer or shorter. And in the bottom left image, you can see that there is a cut there. We managed to finally cut a piece in order to examine the inside. And after we did that, a few days later, I noticed that the loop had moved to the new center. So maybe there is a self-awareness involved in this machine of sorts. Anyway, now that it had finally decided which form it wanted to keep, we could examine it, with the same instruments, scanning electron microscope, X-rays, and everything. This image shows one of its ends. This is not the part that we cut. This is one of its ends, either its top or bottom. And around on its outside, you can see that it's actually rough. It looks like a tree trunk or a road. That's how it looks like. But to the naked eye, it looks smooth and even a little glossy at times. So definitely something, macroscopically and microscopically. This one actually looks like the result of a process that we call calcination. This is used when we when we process a material, we heat the material below its melting point in order to remove some impurities. That's what it's mainly used for. And if you recall, the pictures that I showed you showed it breaking down and they looked like melting. Actually, this is the impression that I got when I first saw those images, that, uh-oh, it's melting. So maybe we are looking at the after effects, even though that doesn't explain how this thing, reassembled itself. Since I found it in different arrangements, in different poses, I then had to believe the witness testimony because it was equally anomalous with what I observed. Anyway, I took that to a university that I will not name because the staff there was absolutely terrified by this object. They didn't want anything, they didn't want to have anything to do with it or with us. But we managed to fit it inside this XRF machine, and these are the results that we got. Now, it contains several elements, and most of them are nickel and titanium. And when I saw that, I was like, wait, we use that in medicine for medical stents, medical implants, of all things. So if the nickel and the titanium were actually alloyed together, something that this machine cannot tell us, but if it were the case, we would be looking at a material that doubles both as a shape memory alloy, because that's what nitinol does, and also as one that is biocompatible, meaning if you leave it inside the human body unshielded, you don't need to shield it, and it will not provoke an immune response from it. Something that most implants do. They do not cause an immune response. They have no entry scars, no nothing. And yes, sure enough, we took it to the X-ray diffraction laboratory, and it was confirmed that the nickel and the titanium are actually alloyed together. With that out of the way, we took it back to the scanning electron microscope laboratory, and we analyzed its insides. And on the inside, you can see that this implant is shown to the left, and to the right is shown another image from a fragment of a spherical UFO that Steve Colburn tested, again to the right, whereas the implant is to the left. The insides were basically the same, and there were several other similarities between the two objects as well. Like, for example, microvoids. There were tiny, tiny holes spread across the inside of the sample, and they were splitting in two further down, by depth. And I only actually noticed that in my sample after I read Steve's analysis of his fragment. I went back to my images, and sure enough, I noticed there were holes. But there is more. In addition to this arachnoidal network, that's what I call it, Steve found in his sample fibrous mats of carbon nanotubes or nanorods, those nanostructures that were coated with a strange substance. Now, many fellow researchers wondered if this arrangement could be used to set up a Byfield Brown effect, an electrogravitic effect. I looked it up in the literature, not as electrogravitics, but as dielectrics and permittivities, and sure enough, a few examples of coated nanotubes came up. The dielectric constants in them, in coated carbon nanotubes, can be as high as 200,000 or up to 1,000,000 at low frequency. Like, to put it into perspective, this material that uses cobalt and iron can be applied over a graphene platelet, and this will give us a permittivity of about 1,000,000. But when you take the same material and you instead apply it to a multi-walled carbon nanotube, we get an extraordinary high permittivity at the power of 12, which is still relatively high even into the megahertz range. And that satisfies a lot of requirements for the electrogravitic effect. You have a high permittivity, you have a very conductive sample, and if you look at the cross section of a multi-walled carbon nanotube, it actually resembles a capacitor. You have the conductive side and then the dielectric in the middle. So while there is no definite proof that coated carbon nanotubes are a means of propulsion in these objects, the current understanding more than allows for it. If a prototype could be made specifically for this application, specifically for this purpose, then it could easily prove or disprove the electrogravitic effect, because as we all know it requires a high dielectric permittivity in your insulator. With such numbers, you could demonstrate it. You could produce a very strong effect. That's what you would expect. So, with all this evidence on these spherical UFOs, I revisited our database and searched for spheres, sphere report in Greece, and I managed to find a few of them that are actually very intimately connected with our topic today. And this brings us to the next part, the second part of my presentation, USOs. Now, not all UFO sightings are created equal. That's what I'd like to say, because a sighting in the sky is usually all there is to it. Like, unless you can film it, with good instrumentation, in order to maybe see the gravitational lensing that Shad presented us, or things like that. That's all there is to your sighting, and that's amazing. You saw a UFO, but if you want to really delve into the phenomenon, we need more information. But that's not the case for USOs. No, USO reports, most of them are very useful, very important, because of their interaction with the nearby bodies of water. This can give us a very good insight on how their field works, because there is no dispute that most of these objects come and go with a field around them, and we need to figure out exactly what it is, not whether it exists or not. It does. So this is one case. This is AI generated. You can tell this was in the island of Kefalonia at the west side of Greece. This island is full of such USO reports. And on one occasion, 3 brown spheres were seen falling into the water at very high speed. And they did that without crashing, without causing a lot of turbulence, nothing. They just went straight into the water and disappeared. Or another case, again AI generated, it was dark night, and there were 2 fishermen on a shore, and they saw as the water started, it was as if it was boiling, it was starting to turn up, and then this big transparent sphere rose from the water, and that was 20 meters from them. That was very close. It was emitting a very high pitched sound, and it just hovered there for a few seconds, and then it shot straight up into the sky and disappeared. Now, this behavior is actually very well known in ufology. And one of the best sources, to my knowledge at least, is this book right here from Carl Fein called UFOs and Water. He doesn't differentiate. He says UFOs are UFOs, same thing as USOs, and I agree. And their interaction with bodies of water, whether that be water, ice, vapor, or even the ground, even the moist ground, shows us, gives us a lot of information on their field, which he proposes that they have one. Reading that book, I began noticing that if you were to take a Searle effect generator, I don't know if it works, but if you were to make a working Searle effect generator and put it inside a saucer-shaped vehicle, that is exactly what you would observe. The geometry of the magnetic field would interact with the water in the way that it is rotating, exactly the way it needs to do if there was a Searle generator inside it. Now, Patrick Jackson's book, The Sphere Network, also revolves around his theory on what these spheres are and how they operate. In Close Encounters, one category of anomalous observations is that cold spots or dramatic temperature fluctuations are noticed in the presence of those small objects. On a few occasions, and that comes from personal communication with the author, on a few occasions, the entire room or the entire area would suddenly become cold when a sphere would make its appearance. Even even on another occasion, like, okay, now we are moving away from the larger UFOs from the book, and we go to the smaller sphere type. The larger UFOs will cause ill effects, adverse health effects on the onlookers very often. And sometimes, even when one of them is landed, there are multiple examples of those. When one of them is landed, if a witness approaches it, it will fly off. So maybe it's a way to to prevent the person from getting hurt. So in this report that I gained through personal communication with a witness, a small sphere, very small sphere, appeared to be scanning his room, and it approached him. Being curious, he reached out and touched the luminous orb. And when he did, his finger started feeling tingly, and it kept feeling so for a few minutes afterwards. This is important because that shows that if if the witness did not experience any health effects in the presence of a functioning UFO, a high powered one to appear luminous, then either those smaller objects run on lower power or they use a different form of energy, one that is safer when they are around humans. And that means they may be made to be around humans. I mean, there is a good example from a friend that I have. He used to be driving out in the desert and he saw two of those large saucer shaped objects come out of the mountain range. And that's the last thing he remembers. Next thing he knows, he wakes up in the hospital with severe burns. And he went back to the site. The road there was burned up, it was black. So this was probably an accident because there is no reason why they would need to attack him, but that just shows you the dangers of approaching one of those objects when you don't know how they work. We need to figure out how they work in order to be better prepared to help these people that may be affected. But I digress. Back on topic on the small spherical objects. This is another curious report that I took from my friend Ion Panidis from Groupon. In this case, the witness was in her living room one day when she saw this transparent sphere enter through the open window. It flew past her without making any sound or causing any health effects, and it proceeded to scan the bedroom, the kitchen, the bedrooms again, and then retraced the entry route and exited the apartment before shooting up at a very high speed to join a blue light that was apparently waiting for it high up in the sky. Talk about portals. The witness was calm, kept calm, and managed to take this amazing photograph. It shows a small transparent sphere that may be a cloaked one with two smaller ones inside it. And they are luminous, meaning they are operational. Their field is on. And that reminds us of the famous Bet sphere. This same old story. Allegedly, it was X-rayed, and it was found that there were two smaller spheres inside it. Same thing. And the Bet sphere in itself reminds us. For some reason, I cannot show this slide, but Ross Coulthard did a documentary recently where he visited Jim Marlin in Texas, who happens to have a sphere that looks almost the exact same as the Bet sphere. And in his case, in Jim Marlin's sphere, this object came from a UFO. Allegedly, a craft flew and it released these multiples of those spheres, and it was picked up by one of his friends, and then he gave it to him. Whereas in the other case, with the transparent sphere, it went to a UFO. So the theory that they are probes or drones sounds plausible in light of these examples. We have other reports, many reports from Greece involving these spheres. This one, for example, is over the Taigetos mountain range, which is close to Sparta. Specifically, that is over a location known as the Pyramid of Taigetos because of the conical mountaintop. It looks like a pyramid. Another example here, same configuration. Notice 3 plus 1. Again, 3 plus 1. This one is from Mount Olympus. And Mount Olympus is actually a hotspot of UFOs. Mount Olympus, I don't know if it has any connection to the myths or not, but data is data. There are so many reports in that area from Mount Olympus all the way up to Thessaloniki, the nearby city. There are dozens of UFOs seen there at each time. One report even shows some 20 or 30 of those small objects. There are a lot of them. And don't even get me started about Athens. The reports of spherical UFOs there abound. There are so many of them. So the point is that even if the spheres run on this relatively simple principle of electrogravity, reports of them go so much back in time that a human origin can effectively be ruled out. The spherical design would help to make the electric field asymmetrical, which is actually required for the Byfield-Brown effect if you read Townsend Brown's papers. And coated carbon nanotubes boast very high dielectric permittivities. So if distinct groups of coated carbon nanotubes were to be spread across a spherical vehicle, they could make it omnidirectional. It could activate, discrete, separate cells in order to quickly move around and change directions. And you would need that if you were to make a small probe or drone for the purpose of moving around buildings or populated areas, which is the behavior that we are observing into the spheres. Our research, again, has to be evidence-based, and I would like to quote Dr. Lear again, that the only way to unlock the secrets of this phenomenon is to follow the science. Now, you have to wonder if the spheres, if those small UFOs are released into populated areas because the larger ones are dangerous, then we are seeing an approach, a purpose that this NHI may have that looks to preserve the human race. It doesn't want to harm us. Whether this preservation happens out of charity or out of interest remains to be seen. But so far, it seems we may have just started looking into patterns that paint the image of a new candidate for man's best friend. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be very happy to answer your questions.